The highway stretched endlessly before Marcus Webb, a ribbon of black asphalt burning under the New Mexico sun. His Harley-Davidson rumbled beneath him, a sound that had become the rhythm of his solitude, a constant, reliable heartbeat that asked nothing of him except fuel and forward motion. 15 years he'd been riding these roads alone, watching the landscape blur into shades of rust and gold, each mile a small mercy between him and the past. He didn't notice the dog at first. It was somewhere around mile marker 47 when he caught movement in his mirrors, a rust-colored shape darting between the sagebrush, keeping pace with the highway. Marcus had learned long ago not to look back too hard at things that followed him. Looking back was how you got caught. Looking back was how promises became chains. But this dog wouldn't stop. By mile marker 52, the animal had pulled onto the asphalt itself, moving with a desperate, limping gait that spoke of hunger, and miles walked on bleeding paws. Marcus slowed. He shouldn't have. The code he lived by now, the quiet one, the solitary one, didn't include stopping for strays. That was the old Marcus. The one who wore a leather vest with a wolf patch over his heart. The one who'd sworn blood oaths and meant every word. What happens next will change everything. Stay with us. The dog's eyes locked onto his. Brown and ancient, they held a clarity that cut through the heat shimmer rising from the road. Marcus pulled the bike to the shoulder, gravel crunching under his tires. The animal approached slowly, as if afraid the man on the machine might disappear like every other promise in its short, brutal life. "Hey, buddy," Marcus whispered, killing the engine. The silence that followed felt sacred, broken only by the wind and the dog's labored breathing. "You got somewhere to be." The dog sat trembling, its ribs showed through matted fur. A collar, once red, hung loose around its neck, a name tag catching the sun. Marcus leaned down, reading the faded letters. Diesel. Diesel, he repeated, the name settling into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. That's a hell of a name for a thing this broken. Diesel didn't move, didn't beg, didn't perform the desperation that most abandoned things did. He simply waited, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to finally stop. Marcus reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a half-empty can of Vienna sausages, road food, survival rations. He opened it with his knife, the metal lid bending back with a small ping. The dog ate like it hadn't seen food in weeks. Maybe it hadn't. When Diesel finished, Marcus looked back down the highway, then forward toward the horizon. In all his years of running, he'd perfected the art of moving through the world without leaving marks, without collecting debts, without becoming the kind of man who answered calls in the middle of the night. That version of Marcus, the one who led men, who made decisions that echoed through other people's lives, was supposed to be dead. But Diesel's collar still had a tag, and tags meant an owner, and an owner meant someone was looking. "All right," Marcus said, opening the passenger seat of his bike, the sidecar he'd kept for no good reason, a ghost of the past. "You ride with me, and we find out where you came from. Then we go back to the road. That's it. That's the only deal I'm making." Diesel climbed in without hesitation, curling into the worn leather like he'd been waiting for exactly this invitation. Marcus kicked the engine to life. The rumble filled the silence, and somewhere in his chest, beneath the carefully constructed walls he'd built over 15 years, something ancient stirred, the part of him that had worn the wolf patch, that had promised his dying brother he would be the kind of man who didn't ride past broken things. The highway bent to the right, following the curve of a ridge, and there, tucked into a ravine where no one traveling fast would ever see it, Marcus spotted something, a narrow dirt road, faded and barely visible, leading down into the scrub and rock. Diesel's body went rigid. His ears pointed forward. He made a sound, not a bark, but something deeper. A call, a signal, a cry. Marcus slowed the bike, Every instinct told him to keep riding. Every learned lesson from 15 years of survival screamed at him to forget what he'd seen. Instead, he turned the bike down the dirt road. The dust rose behind him like smoke from a burned bridge. The kind of bridge that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed, and Marcus Webb, who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of abandonment, rode toward whatever was waiting, carrying a broken dog and a promise he'd thought he'd left behind. The dirt road twisted deeper into the ravine, each turn revealing terrain that seemed designed to hide things. Rocks jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Scrub brush clawed at the air, and above it all, the New Mexico sun beat down with the indifference of a force that had been burning for billions of years and would continue long after men and dogs were dust. Diesel trembled in the sidecar, his whole body vibrating with a frequency that wasn't fear. It was recognition. It was a return. Marcus navigated the bike carefully, feeling the desert floor shift beneath him. He'd ridden through worse terrain. Desert roads in Arizona, mountain passes in Colorado, the kind of places where a man could disappear if he wasn't careful. But this felt different. This felt like entering a tomb. The compound emerged from the landscape like a scar. It was old, maybe 30 years old, maybe older. A cluster of structures built from corrugated metal and rotting wood, arranged in a loose circle around a central yard. The paint had long since surrendered to the sun, and the doors hung at angles that suggested no one had maintained them in years. A water tower stood skeletal against the sky. Fencing, rusted and broken, marked what might have once been containment areas. But what stopped Marcus cold was the sound. Dogs, not one or two, but many. A chorus of barking that had the particular quality of despair, not the aggressive bark of guarded territory, but the broken, hopeful sound of animals that still believed rescue might come. Marcus cut the engine and stood over the bike, surveying the scene. His hand instinctively moved to the knife on his belt. An old habit, a muscle memory from a time when threats had been clear and visible, but there were no threats here, only need. Diesel jumped from the sidecar before Marcus could move, bolting toward the nearest structure, a long, low building that had once perhaps been a kennel. The sound of dogs intensified, barking, whining, the scraping of claws against metal cages. Marcus followed, his boots raising dust with each step. The smell hit him first, a wall of ammonia and decay, the scent of confinement and abandonment. Inside the kennel, the darkness was almost complete, sunlight filtering through gaps in the corrugated walls like knife blades. And in that broken light, Marcus counted them, 12 dogs, maybe 13, all sizes, all colors, all bearing the unmistakable signs of severe neglect, skeletal frames, matted fur, eyes that held the peculiar despair of creatures who had surrendered to their circumstance. The cages were filthy. Water bowls, if they had ever existed, were long gone. Food was a distant memory. These animals hadn't just been abandoned, they'd been forgotten, left to slowly consume themselves while the desert pressed in from all sides. Diesel moved between the cages, his tail low, touching noses with the other dogs through the bars. They knew him. They were greeting him like a brother coming home. Marcus's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone, a satellite model, the only kind of communication that reached out here, and scrolled through his contacts. Names he hadn't called in 15 years. Numbers he'd memorized but never dialed. The old chapter, the Iron Wolves MC. His thumb hovered over the first name. Tommy Gage Richardson, President, Iron Wolves. 15 years ago, Marcus had walked away from the club without explanation, without goodbye, without a note. He'd simply vanished into the desert, carrying his brother's ashes and his own guilt like twin stones. The code was clear. You didn't come back. You didn't call. You didn't ask for help. You became a ghost. But Diesel looked at him from between the cages, and Marcus saw something in that look that transcended the rules he'd built for himself. He saw his brother, not as he'd died, but as he'd lived, broken by the world, yet still reaching for connection, still believing that someone would stay. Marcus scrolled to Tommy's number and pressed call. The satellite signal found the tower somewhere above the desert, bouncing off metal discs floating in space. Crossing the vast distances between abandonment and redemption, Tommy answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting 15 years for exactly this call. "Marcus?" The voice was older, rougher, but unmistakably Tommy. "That you?" "Yeah," Marcus said quietly, looking at the dogs in their cages. "Yeah, it's me." "Jesus Christ, where the hell are you?" "I need to call the whole chapter," Marcus said. "Everyone, I need them here, now." "Why? What's happening?" Marcus looked at Diesel, then back at the 12 other animals, each one a small, breathing embodiment of abandonment. He thought of his brother. He thought of the promise he'd made. He thought of what it meant to be a man who rode past broken things and what it meant to finally stop. "Because we have a pack that needs saving," Marcus said, "and I'm going to need the whole wolf." There was silence on the line. Then Tommy said, "How many?" 81, Marcus replied. "I want all of them." "You got it," Tommy said, and the phone went dead. Marcus stood in the darkness of the kennel, surrounded by the sound of dogs that didn't know they were about to be saved. And in that moment, the man who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of solitude felt the first crack in the walls he'd built. Outside, the desert sun continued its relentless work, burning the earth red, waiting for the sound of engines that would soon fill the silence. The call went out at 3:17 p.m. By 3:47 p.m., the first bikes were rolling, a convoy that started small and grew exponentially as it moved through New Mexico. Tommy hit the main chapter first, then the satellite chapters, then the allied clubs who owed debts to the Iron Wolves. The message was simple. "Marcus is calling. All hands. Drop everything." No one asked why. That was the code. You didn't ask. You rode. By 5:30 p.m., the desert road leading to the compound had become something it hadn't been in years. A highway of thunder. 81 riders, their engines creating a sound like distant war, moved across the landscape in formation. Colors flew. Leather vests bearing the Iron Wolves patch, the silver and black of allied clubs. The intricate stitching of ranks and honors earned through years of living by a code that outsiders couldn't understand. Tommy Richardson led the main group, his Harley-Davidson Fat Boy at the center of the convoy. He was 63 now, his beard streaked with silver, his body marked by decades of riding hard and living harder. But his eyes were the same as they'd been when Marcus left, clear, focused, carrying the weight of command with the ease of a man born to it. Behind him rode the officers, Gage, the road captain, responsible for routing and logistics, Snake, the sergeant-at-arms, his massive frame hunched over his bike with the grace of someone who'd learned to move through the world despite his size. Doc, not a medical doctor, but the club's fixer, the man who knew people who knew things, and 20 more names, faces, histories. The satellite chapters brought their own presidents and officers, 43 riders from Albuquerque, 22 from Las Vegas, and a dozen independent riders who'd heard the call and come because they rode with the Iron Wolves in their hearts, even if they didn't wear the patch. 81 engines, 81 riders, all converging on a compound in the desert where Marcus Webb stood surrounded by 12 starving dogs and a promise that had finally come calling. The dust began rising miles before they arrived, a plume visible from the compound, growing larger, taking shape, becoming an event. Diesel stood at the fence and howled, a sound of recognition, of belonging, of the understanding that rescue doesn't come quietly. It comes with the roar of 100 horses, with the rumble of machines that have traveled through deserts and mountains and years, with the weight of brotherhood that had been tested by time and distance and the corrosive force of the world itself. Marcus watched from the compound as the first bikes began to arrive. Tommy pulled up first, his engine going silent as he dismounted with the deliberate movements of a man who'd learned to economize his energy. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a face marked by time and experience, and looked at Marcus for a long moment. 15 years. 15 years of silence, distance, abandonment. "You look like hell," Tommy said finally. "You look like you got old," Marcus replied. Tommy grinned, a real grin, the kind that carried relief and joy and the particular satisfaction of a man who'd been proven right. "Told you that you couldn't stay gone forever," he said. "Told you that day you rode out. I said, 'Marcus, you gonna run until you run into yourself.' Guess you finally did." The other riders were dismounting now, parking their bikes in neat rows, their shadows stretching long across the compound as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. 81 patches, 81 stories, all of them here, now, in this place, for reasons that didn't require explanation. Snake walked over to the kennel, his expression shifting from the hardness of the road to something softer, something wounded. "Jesus," he breathed, looking at the cages. "How long have they been like this?" "Weeks," Marcus said. "Maybe months. One of them followed me down the highway, led me here." Doc was already on his phone, calling veterinary clinics across the state, making arrangements, pulling strings, using the kind of influence that only a man who'd spent 40 years building networks could wield. Within 20 minutes, he'd identified a veterinary emergency clinic 20 miles away and negotiated for them to stay open through the night. The riders organized themselves with the efficiency of an army. Some began constructing temporary holding pens from materials found around the compound. Others ran water hoses to the kennels, washing away years of accumulated filth. 2 of the younger riders, prospects still earning their patches, were assigned to food duty, opening cans of premium dog food that Tommy had somehow procured during the drive, mixing it with broth, feeding the animals by hand. Marcus stood in the center of it all, watching the machine of brotherhood activate around him. Watching men he hadn't seen in 15 years move with the coordination of a unit that had never truly disbanded. They'd just been waiting for a call that would bring them back together. One of the dogs, a black and white pit bull missing half an ear, ate from Snake's hand, its whole body trembling with the overwhelming experience of gentleness. Snake's jaw clenched, his eyes glistening in the desert light. "No more," he whispered to the dog. "No more waiting, no more alone." By 8:47 p.m., the convoy was ready to move. The dogs, cleaned and fed and evaluated by Doc's trained eye, were loaded into vehicles prepared for transport. Diesel rode with Marcus, his head resting on the Harley's sidecar, his body finally at rest in a way it might not have been since before he was abandoned. As the riders mounted their bikes, Tommy pulled Marcus aside. "You ever coming back?" he asked. "To the club." Marcus looked at the desert, now swallowing the last light of day. He thought about promises. He thought about his brother. He thought about a dog's eyes, locking onto his from a highway median, choosing him, following him, leading him home. "Yeah," Marcus said. "Yeah, I think I am. And now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact hour you heard this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments they reach you. The veterinary clinic in Santa Fe wasn't prepared for 81 bikers descending on their parking lot at 10:15 p.m., but they adapted with the grace of professionals who understood that sometimes mercy didn't arrive on a convenient schedule. Dr. Sarah Chen, the clinic's owner and head veterinarian, had been closing up when Doc's call came through. She'd initially declined. The clinic was small, understaffed, and running an emergency protocol for 12 severely neglected animals in a single night seemed impossible. But Doc had a way of making impossible things seem inevitable. By the time the convoy arrived, he'd convinced her not only to stay open, but to call in 2 additional veterinarians and 4 vet techs, all of whom understood the gravity of the situation without needing explanations. "You're the man with the dogs," Dr. Chen said, meeting Marcus at the clinic entrance. She was younger than he'd expected, early 40s, with the kind of direct gaze that spoke of a person who'd chosen medicine because she believed in saving lives, not saving profit margins. "That's me," Marcus said. "Your friends have already paid the deposit," she said, nodding toward Tommy, who was making phone calls at the far end of the waiting room, coordinating with other clubs, arranging for follow-up care, ensuring that none of these animals would ever again be vulnerable to abandonment. "What I need from you is information, names if you have them, medical histories, anything about how long they've been neglected." "Only one of them I know," Marcus said, looking through the window toward the examination rooms where the dogs were being assessed. "Diesel, the rust-colored German Shepherd mix. He's the one who found me." Dr. Chen made a note. "The others will take time to evaluate. Some of them are going to need IV fluids, antibiotics, possible surgical intervention for infections, but they're alive, they're conscious, and they're already responding to food and water. That's survival. Tomorrow, we move toward thriving." She looked at Marcus with an expression that suggested she understood something fundamental about him, that he carried weight, that he moved through the world with the burden of unmet promises, that the arrival of 12 dogs in a veterinary clinic was somehow connected to the arrival of 81 bikers in a parking lot under the New Mexico stars. "You did the right thing," she said quietly, stopping, calling, not looking away. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Inside the examination rooms, a different kind of rescue was taking place. Dr. Chen's team moved with precision and compassion, examining each animal with the kind of attention that suggested they understood. Every dog here had been a decision to stay alive, a choice to keep breathing, despite the clear message that the world had forgotten them. The pit bull with the missing ear, they called him Champ during the examination, was in surprisingly good health despite his malnutrition. His injuries were old, healing, the work of someone's deliberate cruelty that had occurred years before abandonment, but he had survived it. And now, in the warmth of a clinic where people cared, he'd begun to understand that survival might lead to something more than mere endurance. Snake sat in the waiting room, unable to watch the medical procedures, but unable to leave either. He scrolled through his phone, looking at pictures of his own dogs at home. A German Shepherd and a rescue mutt he'd picked up off the streets of Las Vegas 5 years ago. 2 animals who'd found safety in his home, who slept on his bed, who'd transformed from scared, defensive creatures into beings capable of receiving love. "They're going to be okay," he told Marcus, his voice rough. "All of them. You called it in time." The night progressed with the steady rhythm of medical intervention. IVs were placed in dehydrated veins. Wounds were cleaned and dressed, and blood was drawn for testing. X-rays revealed no significant breaks, though a small terrier mix showed signs of a healed fracture that suggested a history of trauma before abandonment. By 2:30 a.m., the assessments were complete. Dr. Chen emerged with her team, all of them looking exhausted but satisfied. 12 animals, 12 survivors, all stable, all responding, all with a future that extended beyond the compound in the desert. "Here's the situation," she said, addressing Marcus and the gathered riders. "These dogs need continued medical attention, follow-up appointments, medications, behavioral assessment. Some will need physical therapy, all of them will need time to process their trauma and learn that the world contains kindness. That's going to take months, potentially years." "What do you need?" Tommy asked. "Foster homes," Dr. Chen said. "Places where they can recover in a calm environment, with people who understand their needs, who won't judge their fear responses, who'll work with them through the healing process. I can facilitate the adoptions eventually, but the immediate need is stability." The bikers exchanged glances. Then, without fanfare, without discussion, hands began to rise. One, then another, then another. By the time the silence settled, 53 of the 81 riders had volunteered to take a dog into their home, to provide shelter, food, medicine, time, patience, and the particular magic that only comes when someone who has known abandonment decides to protect another abandoned thing. Snake took Champ. Gage, the road captain, a man built like a boulder, took a trembling Chihuahua mix that weighed maybe 8 pounds. Doc took a black Labrador retriever with serious trust issues and eyes that had learned not to hope. And on, down the list of names and riders, until 12 animals had 12 homes and 12 promises to keep. Marcus took Diesel, of course, the German shepherd mix that had followed him down a highway and led him back to the life he'd abandoned. "What happens now?" Marcus asked Dr. Chen as the sun began its earliest stirrings on the eastern horizon. "Now you all go home," she said. "You love these animals. You give them time. You show them that broken can be repaired, that abandoned doesn't have to mean alone, that somewhere in this hard world there are people willing to stop and help. And then, Dr. Chen smiled, you come back and tell me how they're doing, because I think what you've built here, all of you, is exactly the kind of network these dogs needed. Not a system, not a process. Just men and women who understand that loyalty means something, that promises matter, that the price of brotherhood is sometimes as simple as feeding another living thing and refusing to look away. As the riders began mounting their bikes, Diesel walked between them, moving from one to another, touching noses, saying goodbye to the animals he'd come to know during the night. The other dogs watched from the clinic windows, their eyes tracking the convoy as it prepared to disperse. And in that moment, before the engines roared to life and the riders scattered back across the desert to their homes, Marcus understood something he'd been running from for 15 years, that promises weren't chains. They were bridges. They were the only structures that connected the abandoned to the saved, the broken to the healing, the alone to the loved. The convoy dispersed as the sun painted the New Mexico sky in shades of amber and rose. 81 riders becoming smaller groups, then pairs, then individuals, each one carrying a dog toward a home that would suddenly, unexpectedly, have more purpose than it had possessed the day before. Marcus rode with Tommy, their bikes moving side by side down a highway that felt different now, the same asphalt, the same landscape, but infused with new meaning. Diesel sat in the sidecar, his head tilted back, feeling the wind for what might have been the first time in his life without fear. "I owe you an explanation," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the space between the engines. "You don't owe me anything," Tommy replied, "but I'll listen if you want to talk." So Marcus talked. He talked about the day he'd left, the day his brother had died, not from violence or accident, but from the slow, corrosive force of a life that had never learned to hold value. He talked about carrying his brother's ashes into the desert, about the promise he'd made, to be the kind of man who didn't let broken things stay broken, who didn't ride past people suffering, who chose solitude over the risk of failing someone again. "But I failed anyway," Marcus said, "by not being there, by choosing silence over showing up." "You were grieving," Tommy said simply. "Grief makes us do weird things, doesn't make it wrong, just makes it human." They rode in silence for a while, the desert sliding past them, the world opening up in ways that desert vistas always did, making individual problems seem smaller, yet somehow simultaneously more significant. "Your brother," Tommy continued, "he'd be proud of you. What you did today, those dogs, that's legacy. That's the kind of thing that lasts." Marcus thought about his brother's eyes, so similar to Diesel's actually, if he really considered it, that particular quality of looking at the world while carrying the weight of it. His brother had never learned to accept help, had never allowed people to stop for him, had ridden alone through his suffering until the road ran out. By contrast, Marcus had stopped. He'd called. He'd accepted that rescue sometimes required asking, that strength sometimes meant admitting you couldn't do it alone, that brotherhood was more than an idea on a motorcycle patch. It was a lived practice of showing up. The road to Marcus's home was long, 50 miles of highway leading to a property set back in the high desert, a small ranch where he'd spent the last 15 years learning solitude. As he pulled through the gates and drove toward the house, Diesel began to tremble with recognition and anticipation. "You know this place," Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. "You've been here before." Diesel didn't respond verbally, but his body language shifted into something like homecoming. This had been his place once. This had been where he'd lived before whatever circumstance had driven him into abandonment. Someone had owned him here, loved him here, lost him here. Marcus looked around the property with new eyes. The fence, which had always seemed sufficient before, now felt incomplete. There was no shelter structure specifically designed for a dog, no shade area in the yard. No sense that this space had ever been conceived as a place for animal life to flourish. He pulled out his phone and called Gage, who'd taken the Chihuahua mix and lived about 40 minutes away. "I need help building something," Marcus said when Gage answered. "Dog shelter, shaded play area, proper fencing. Can you organize it?" "When?" Gage asked. "Tomorrow. Is tomorrow too soon?" Gage laughed, a genuine warm sound. "Brother, tomorrow we're building it. I'll call the others. We'll have it done by sunset." And that's how it began. The network of rescue that had started with a dog following a biker on a highway became something larger, something more organized, something that extended beyond simple adoption into genuine community care. Over the next 3 weeks, the riders established a system. Weekly check-ins, shared veterinary appointments, a rotating schedule of maintenance for the homes where the rescued dogs were recovering. Snake documented the transformations, posting pictures online showing Champ going from a trembling, traumatized creature into a dog capable of playing, of trusting, of receiving love without flinching. The story spread through the biking community, then beyond it. Local news picked it up. Local motorcycle club rescues 12 abandoned dogs from desert compound. The story ran across regional stations, then national ones. 81 riders became symbols of something that the world desperately needed to see. Men willing to care deeply, men who understood that strength included vulnerability, men who rode towards suffering instead of away from it. But for Marcus, the real transformation was internal. Diesel healed. His coat grew thick and shiny. His eyes, which had held the peculiar despair of abandonment, began to reflect something new. Trust, belonging, the understanding that he'd been chosen and would be protected. The trembling stopped. The fear reduced. And one morning, about 3 weeks after the rescue, Marcus woke to find Diesel on his bed, not seeking safety, but offering companionship. The animal had moved from desperate need to chosen proximity. "You did good," Tommy said one evening, sitting on Marcus's porch watching the sunset with a beer in his hand. Diesel lay between them, his head on Marcus's leg, completely at peace. "We did good," Marcus corrected. "All of us." "You want to come back?" Tommy asked. "Full-time, club business. We've got projects. We've got people who need help. We've got a war chest of resources and the will to use them. We could do more of this." Marcus considered it. 15 years of solitude had felt like the only honest way to live. But watching Diesel sleep, feeling the warmth of the dog's body against his leg, understanding that rescue was possible because he'd been willing to stop and look. Maybe solitude had never been the goal. Maybe it had been preparation. "Yeah," Marcus said. "Yeah, I'll come back." Tommy smiled, raised his beer, and they sat in silence as the desert absorbed the day's light, preparing for the darkness, knowing that tomorrow would bring more daylight, more roads, more opportunities to stop for broken things and choose mercy. The official re-induction ceremony took place on a Saturday evening in a desert facility that the Iron Wolves owned outside of Phoenix. It was a formal affair, more formal than Marcus had expected, with representatives from 17 different MC chapters attending, along with various allied riders and supporters who understood that what was happening wasn't just a man rejoining a club, it was a statement that redemption was possible, that promises could be kept even after 15 years of abandonment, that the code meant something because men continued to choose it. Tommy stood before the assembly, leather vest bearing the patches of his rank and experience, his presence commanding without demand. To his right stood Snake, Gage, and Doc, the pillars of the original chapter, the men who'd held the Brotherhood together while Marcus was gone. "Brothers," Tommy began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of service. "We gather to welcome home a brother who left the club to honor a personal grief, but who never truly abandoned the code. Marcus Webb has spent 15 years proving that the Iron Wolves patch doesn't define the man. The man defines what the patch means. And in his return, he brings proof that loyalty transcends time, that brotherhood heals broken things, and that some promises are worth the long journey home." Doc stepped forward with Marcus's vest, a new one, unworn, bearing the traditional Iron Wolves patch, but also something new. Below the primary emblem, a small patch featuring a German shepherd's head and the words "Rescue Rider" embroidered in silver thread. "This patch," Doc explained to the assembly, "represents Marcus's vow that Iron Wolves business now includes rescue operations. Any animal abandoned, any creature left to suffer becomes Iron Wolves business. We ride for the broken, we stop for the discarded. We become their voice when they have none." He placed the vest on Marcus's shoulders. It felt right in a way he hadn't expected, not heavy but weighted with significance. The leather was stiff, new, but it carried the imprint of 40 years of accumulated brotherhood. Snake stepped forward and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Welcome home, brother." The assembly erupted in the particular sound of bikers expressing approval, a combination of engine revs, shouts, and the specific affection that comes from witnessing a man complete his journey home. But the real confirmation came from the dogs. All 12 rescue dogs had been brought to the ceremony, an unprecedented decision that some of the older riders questioned until they understood the symbolism. Diesel ran straight to Marcus, his whole body expressing the kind of joy that only comes from perfect recognition. And one by one the other rescued animals approached, greeting him, acknowledging him, understanding at some level that this man had become their guardian, their voice, their proof that broken things could be saved. Snake's champ limped over and placed his massive head on Marcus's leg, something that a month ago would have been impossible for a dog traumatized by abandonment. Gage's Chihuahua, named by the old biker Pearl, climbed into Marcus's lap, seeking the reassurance of being held. The sight of 81 bikers surrounded by 12 dogs, all of them gathered under the desert stars, became something that transcended the brotherhood of men. It became a statement about what it meant to be human, to be loyal, to refuse to look away from suffering. The journalist who was there to cover the ceremony for a motorcycle culture publication watched it happen and understood that she was witnessing something rare. A moment where cynicism couldn't survive, where the hardness that the world demanded couldn't quite penetrate the circle of love and protection that had formed. Later, as the celebration continued inside the facility, music, food, stories, the particular bonding that comes from brothers gathering, Marcus stood outside with Tommy, looking at the desert spreading out beneath the stars. "Doc told me about the Foundation," Marcus said. Tommy nodded. "Rescue dogs of the Iron Wolves. We're incorporating it as a non-profit. Official partnerships with veterinary clinics, foster network across 6 states. We're going to systematize it, make it sustainable. Using club resources, using everything we have, Tommy confirmed. Money, time, connections, brotherhood. That's what the club is for, Marcus. Not just to ride, but to care, to build, to transform suffering into rescue. You were right to leave when you needed to, but you're right to come back now. Diesel appeared at Marcus's side, as if understanding that his human was having an important conversation. The dog's presence was grounding, real, a constant reminder of the journey that had brought them all here. I made a promise to my brother, Marcus said quietly, the day he died. I promised I'd be the kind of man who didn't let broken things stay broken. I thought I needed to do it alone. I thought solitude was the answer. But, Tommy prompted, but Diesel showed me that rescue is never solitary, that the only way to truly save something is together. The Brotherhood wasn't just a motorcycle club, it was the infrastructure for compassion. I couldn't have done this without all of you. Tommy put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. That's why we're brothers, son. We do the impossible together. We ride for each other. We protect what's broken. That's the promise we all made, the day we put on the patch. The celebration continued into the night. The 81 riders and the 12 dogs became a sort of mythology being created in real time. The story of rescue that transcended species, the proof that brotherhood meant something in a world that had largely abandoned the concept. As dawn approached and the riders began to disperse, heading back to their homes and their jobs and their lives, each one carrying with them the confirmation that their lives had purpose beyond themselves, Marcus sat in his truck with Diesel sleeping against his leg, feeling something he hadn't felt in 15 years, belonging, not the desperate, defensive belonging of a man surrounded by others who needed him, but the genuine belonging of someone who had traveled alone, found himself, and discovered that the only journey worth taking was one that led back home. Like this video if you believe in second chances and redemption. Your support helps us tell more stories about rescue, brotherhood, and hope. By 3 months after the rescue, what had started as a single emergency call had become something larger than anyone had anticipated. The rescue dogs of the Iron Wolves Foundation was now officially registered as a 501c3 non-profit, with chapters established in Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, California, Utah, and Colorado. What had begun with 12 dogs had expanded to 73 animals in foster care, all of them moving through a recovery process that included veterinary care, behavioral rehabilitation, and preparation for permanent adoption. But the most transformative development was something less quantifiable, a network of human connection that had been sparked into existence by the simple choice to stop and help. Doc had taken over as executive director of the foundation, using his decades of networking experience to build relationships with shelters, veterinary clinics, and rescue organizations across the Southwest. Snake became the operations coordinator, managing logistics, schedules, and the day-to-day machinery of rescue. Gage, despite his intimidating appearance, had discovered an unexpected gift for public relations, telling the story of the rescue in ways that inspired others to join the effort. And Marcus became something he'd never expected, a symbol. News outlets continued to pick up variations of the rescue story. Local stations ran feature segments about individual dogs finding their forever homes. One story followed Champ, Snake's pit bull, as he was adopted by a family in Las Vegas that had lost their own dog 6 months prior. The transformation from traumatized animal to beloved family member became a metaphor for redemption that resonated far beyond the motorcycle community. But with visibility came complications. The compound in the desert where the dogs had been abandoned became a point of legal interest. investigation revealed that it had once been a breeding facility for fighting dogs, an operation that had been abandoned when authorities began investigating. The dogs had been left behind not through simple negligence, but as evidence being collected for a criminal case. The case had been shelved, filed away, forgotten, much like the dogs themselves. When Marcus learned this, something shifted in him. Diesel wasn't just a rescued dog. Diesel was a survivor of a criminal enterprise, a victim of systemic abandonment, a creature that had made choices to survive in spite of deliberate harm designed to end him. "We need to go after the people responsible," Marcus said during a foundation meeting. Doc shook his head. "That's not our mandate. We rescue. We don't pursue justice." "Why not?" Marcus asked. "If we're going to truly save these animals, we need to make sure the systems that created their abandonment get disrupted. We need to make it so that what happened to these 12 doesn't happen to 12 more." It was Gage who found the middle ground. "We don't pursue it directly, but we support law enforcement who wants to. We become the evidence. We become the proof that these animals matter, that their survival has value, that the crime of abandonment isn't victimless." Working with prosecutors and animal welfare investigators, the Iron Wolves helped build a case that ultimately led to prosecutions for animal cruelty and abandonment. More importantly, it led to policy changes in how abandoned animals were handled, requirements that they not be left for long periods without care, protocols for checking on animals in facilities, mandatory reporting for anyone who discovered the kind of conditions that had nearly killed Diesel and his companions. The rescue had become advocacy. The rescue had become a wedge that began to shift systems. But for Marcus, the real transformation was personal. 3 months into his return to the club, he'd moved into a larger property with proper facilities for Diesel and 3 other rescue dogs that he was fostering long-term. The isolation of his former solitude had been replaced with something that looked a lot like community. The riders would stop by, ostensibly to check on the dogs, but really to check on him, to ensure he was healing in the ways that mattered most. Tommy came by one evening, and they sat on the porch watching the sunset, much as they had on Marcus's smaller property months before. "I've been thinking about succession," Tommy said quietly. "My knees aren't what they were. The rides get harder each year. I've been president for 22 years, and I think it might be time to transition that responsibility to someone else." Marcus understood what Tommy wasn't saying directly. "You want me to consider it?" "I want you to know it's available," Tommy replied. "I'm not going anywhere, but leadership is something we need to think about longer term. The club's evolved. We're doing rescue work now. We're becoming an advocacy organization. That requires a particular kind of thinking, the kind that sees beyond the traditional MC structure." "I'll think about it," Marcus said. But the truth was, he was already thinking about it. He was already imagining what it might look like to lead the Iron Wolves not just as a motorcycle club, but as an organized force for rescue and redemption. To build a structure where stopping for broken things wasn't just individual choice, but organizational mandate. To create something that would outlast any single rider, any single leader, any single moment of compassion. That night, after Tommy had left, Marcus took Diesel for a walk through the desert behind his property. The dog had learned freedom, not the defensive, fearful kind, but the genuine kind that comes from knowing you're safe and valued. He ran ahead, his tail streaming behind him, and for the first time in his life, Diesel was simply a dog being a dog, playing, exploring, living in the present moment without the weight of his past crushing him. Marcus watched from a distance and thought about the nature of rescue. It wasn't just about pulling someone out of suffering. It was about teaching them that the world contained joy. It was about helping them believe that their life had value. It was about creating the conditions in which transformation could occur. He thought about his brother and about the 15 years he'd spent believing that solitude was the only honest response to grief and failure. He thought about how wrong he'd been and how grateful he was that Diesel had been persistent enough, broken enough, desperate enough to find him and drag him back toward connection. The stars emerged as darkness settled over the desert. Diesel returned to Marcus's side, panting happily, ready to head home. And as they walked back toward the property, toward the lights of the house, toward the community that had formed around the rescue, Marcus understood something fundamental. The promise to his brother hadn't been about suffering alone. It had been about caring deeply, about choosing to show up, about building structures of compassion that could hold more than one broken thing. The promise had always been meant to be lived in community, through the brotherhood that meant something, because men continued to choose it day after day, ride after ride, rescue after rescue. 6 months after Diesel followed Marcus down the highway, the rescue dogs of the Iron Wolves Foundation was invited to present before a state legislature committee on animal welfare policy. It was an unprecedented opportunity. A motorcycle club, born in the counterculture of the 1970s, now being asked to testify before the people who made laws. Marcus was chosen to present the foundation's case. The state capitol building was imposing in ways that the desert had never been. Marble corridors, security checkpoints, the particular weight of institutional power bearing down from above. Marcus had dressed carefully for the occasion, not in colors, but in a simple dark suit, though he kept his motorcycle boots as a quiet statement of identity that wouldn't be ignored. The committee was composed of 12 legislators, ranging from deeply skeptical to cautiously interested. Marcus carried with him a presentation that included statistics, case studies, policy recommendations. But more than anything, he carried a story. He told them about Diesel, about a dog that had been abandoned in a compound designed to create suffering, about a man traveling through the desert who'd been willing to stop, about 81 riders who'd answered a single phone call, about the transformation of one animal and the systemic changes that one rescue had catalyzed. The dogs that we rescued weren't just abandoned, Marcus testified, his voice steady. They were evidence of a system that treats animal welfare as an afterthought. They were proof that isolation and cruelty can exist for months without intervention. They were symptoms of a larger disease, the idea that once something is broken, it can be left to suffer without consequence. He presented the policy recommendations: mandatory animal welfare checks for facilities, licensing requirements, enforcement mechanisms that made abandonment an actual crime with actual punishment. But more than that, Marcus continued, we're asking for a recognition that rescue is a form of justice, that when we choose to save suffering, we're not just being kind, we're being just. We're saying that life has value. We're saying that broken things deserve to be fixed. We're saying that community has responsibility. One of the legislators, a woman named Chen, who'd been reading through documents during the testimony, looked up and asked, "Your foundation, the Iron Wolves MC, you're a motorcycle club. How is it that an organization traditionally associated with, well, with aspects of society that don't always align with law enforcement, has become an animal welfare advocate?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Because we learned that the code of the brotherhood applies to all living things. Because we understood that what unites us isn't the rebellion against society. It's the commitment to protect those who can't protect themselves. The patch represents loyalty, loyalty to each other, and now loyalty to every animal that we have the power to rescue." The testimony lasted 47 minutes. When it ended, the committee stood, something they apparently didn't do for most presentations, and within 3 months, legislation based on the Iron Wolves' recommendations had been drafted and introduced to the state legislature. But the real significance of the testimony became apparent when other MC clubs began to reach out. Clubs from Texas, from California, from Colorado and Wyoming started establishing their own rescue networks. The concept of motorcycle clubs as organized forces for animal welfare and rescue began to spread, slowly but undeniably. What had started with one dog following one biker became a movement, not organized from above, but organically growing from the recognition that the Brotherhood Code could be applied to something larger than the club itself. Back home in Arizona, Marcus received calls from riders representing clubs he'd never heard of. Clubs that operated in the margins of society, but had recognized that rescue was a form of redemption. Each call represented another network of riders ready to stop for broken things, ready to answer a call, ready to use their resources and their brotherhood for something that transcended the traditional boundaries of MC culture. The Iron Wolves clubhouse expanded. What had been headquarters for motorcycle business became a command center for rescue operations. Maps on the walls showed rescue locations across 6 states. Spreadsheets tracked animals in foster care, adoption timelines, success stories. The particular chaos of a working motorcycle club was gradually overlaid with the organization necessary to run a functional non-profit. One evening, as Marcus was reviewing applications for new foster homes, Snake walked in carrying something unexpected, a dog wearing an Iron Wolves motorcycle vest. "You've got to be kidding me," Marcus said, standing up. "I'm not," Snake replied. "One of the riders in Nevada custom-made these for the dogs. We're thinking about providing them to all the rescue animals once they're adopted. Marketing, sure, but also statement. These animals are part of the club now. They're under the club's protection." Marcus picked up the vest, small, carefully constructed, bearing a modified version of the Iron Wolves patch. It was absurd and brilliant, and exactly the kind of thing that the Brotherhood had always been. A visible statement of belonging to something larger than yourself. "Show me how many we need," Marcus said. The 5-year anniversary of the rescue took place on a Saturday in October 2030, on a property outside Phoenix that the Iron Wolves had purchased specifically as a sanctuary for rescued animals. What had started as a single emergency response to 12 starving dogs had evolved into something far more substantial. A network spanning 8 states over 200 animals rescued and rehabilitated, adoption success rates exceeding 97%, and a cultural shift in how motorcycle clubs understood their role in society. Diesel was 14 now, old for a dog, particularly one that had experienced the trauma of abandonment. His muzzle was grey, his movements slower, but his eyes retained that clarity of purpose that had, in a strange way, saved Marcus's life. The anniversary celebration gathered riders from across the network. The Arizona chapter, now numbering 140 riders, had grown to include women, different racial backgrounds, a complete transformation from the traditional structure that had dominated MC culture for decades. Snake had stepped into a leadership role, continuing to expand rescue operations while maintaining the core values of loyalty and protection. Tommy, now 70, had officially stepped down as president 18 months prior. Marcus had taken over, bringing to the position a vision that extended the club's mission beyond traditional boundaries. Patch restrictions were being relaxed for anyone who wanted to participate in rescue work. The colors now included a secondary patch representing animal welfare, and there were serious discussions about what it might mean for the club to formally transform into something beyond traditional MC structure. "You ever miss the simplicity?" Tommy asked, sitting with Marcus on the porch of the sanctuary. Diesel dozed between them, his breathing easy, his body relaxed in the way of an animal that had learned finally that rest was safe. "Sometimes," Marcus admitted, "but I don't regret the complexity. The complexity is where the real work happens. Below them, in a large fenced area, dogs that had been rescued in the past year were playing, running, wrestling, engaging in the pure joy of movement and companionship. Some were available for adoption. Others would remain in sanctuary care, too traumatized or too old to transition to traditional homes. The Iron Wolves had accepted that rescue wasn't always about ending with adoption. Sometimes it was about providing a stable, safe place where a broken thing could simply exist without suffering. "Did you ever think," Tommy said, "back when you were riding alone in the desert, that you'd end up here?" "No," Marcus replied. "I thought I had it figured out. Grief required isolation. Promise required solitude. Redemption required suffering alone. And now I understand that the best promises are the ones we keep together, that grief becomes bearable when shared, that redemption only has meaning when it extends to others." The celebration that night gathered over 200 riders and their families. There were speeches and testimonies and videos of dogs describing their journeys from abandonment to adoption. There was music and food and the particular warmth that comes from people gathered around a shared purpose. But the most significant moment came when a woman walked onto the stage carrying a dog, a rescue from the original compound, one of the 12 that had followed Diesel into redemption. "This is Bella," the woman said, tears streaming down her face. "She was one of the original 12. When we adopted her 3 years ago, she was so traumatized that we didn't think she'd ever really adjust. But look at her now." The dog, previously a skeleton wrapped in matted fur, was healthy, vibrant, the picture of a creature that had learned to trust. She looked at her adoptive mother with an expression of complete devotion, and there wasn't a dry eye in the gathering. As the evening continued and people began to disperse, Marcus took Diesel for a final walk through the sanctuary grounds. The desert night wrapped around them, cool, clear, infinite. The dog moved slowly, enjoying the sensation of being outside, and Marcus found himself thinking about time. 15 years of isolation, 15 years of running, and then a dog that wouldn't stop following, that made a choice to be persistent, that led him back to the life he'd abandoned. The synchronicity of it still struck him, the particular grace of a moment where everything changed because a single creature decided not to give up. "We did something good," Marcus told Diesel, whose head was resting against his leg as they walked. "Not perfect, but good, and that matters." Diesel's tail moved slowly, acknowledging, confirming. Back at the sanctuary, the riders were beginning to gather again, preparing for a final ride, a tradition they'd established for anniversaries. 81 riders who'd answered the original call had been reduced by death and retirement, but the number had been replaced by new brothers and sisters who understood that the code meant protecting what was broken. As the engines roared to life and the convoy prepared to roll, Marcus took one final look at the sanctuary, at the structures that had been built, the systems that had been created, the lives that had been saved. He thought about his brother and about how the promise he'd made that day had never been about suffering alone. It had always been about building structures of compassion large enough to hold more than one broken thing. The lead bike, Tommy's. Actually, the former president always took point for the anniversary rides, pulled out of the facility and onto the desert highway. And like clockwork, like a ritual being performed for the 5,000th time, 81 engines followed, their roar filling the darkness with the sound of purpose, loyalty, and the particular grace of a promise being kept. Marcus rode near the center of the pack, Diesel secured safely behind him as the convoy moved across the desert toward the dawn. And for the first time in decades, riding at night, surrounded by the rumble of brothers and sisters committed to the same vision, Marcus understood what redemption actually meant. It wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't about suffering alone to prove your worth. It wasn't about isolation or silence or the masculine myth of bearing weight without help. Redemption was about allowing yourself to be found by grace in the form of a stray dog's persistent eyes. It was about answering a call you thought you'd abandoned. It was about building structures with other broken people, knowing that together you could save things that couldn't save themselves. The sun rose as the convoy reached its final destination, a memorial site where the Iron Wolves had planted a garden, dedicating it to all the animals that had been rescued and those still waiting in the darkness for someone to stop and choose mercy. And as the riders dismounted their bikes, as Diesel walked between them greeting old friends, as the morning light illuminated faces marked by experience and time and the particular weathering that comes from a life lived with intensity, Marcus understood that he'd finally come home. Not to a place, but to a purpose. Not to solitude, but to community. Not to a promise he carried alone, but to a vow that was being kept by hundreds of people who'd decided, like he had, that stopped engines and raised hands were the beginning of rescue. Thank you for riding with us to the end of Marcus's story. If you believe in second chances, if you support rescue and redemption, please subscribe to this channel and join the Iron Wolves community. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that broken things can be saved. Together, we ride toward hope. See you on the next one, brothers and sisters. Mo.